want to tell you about the week my quiet neighborhood turned into a battlefield over 18 inches of grass. 18 inches. That is all it took to reveal 3 years of lies, a forged document, and a homeowners association president who thought her clipboard made her untouchable. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I have lived in the same house on Larkspur Court for 11 years. I bought it 2 years after my wife Melissa and I got married. We raised our 2 kids in that house. I built a deck with my own hands. I planted a maple tree the day my son was born, and it now stands taller than the roofline. Every inch of that yard means something to me, especially the small strip along the eastern edge where my wife keeps her rose garden, the same garden her mother helped her plant before she passed away. That garden sits right along our boundary fence, a simple white picket fence I installed 9 years ago, based on the property survey we received when we purchased the home. For 9 years, nobody said a word about it. Not the neighbors, not the county, not the homeowners association. It was just there, quiet and unremarkable, holding roses and marking the edge of everything we had built. Then Karen Whitfield became HOA president. I want to be fair here, because I know how these stories usually go, and I do not want you to think I am exaggerating for effect. Karen was not a cartoon villain when she started. She was, by most accounts, a woman who cared deeply about the neighborhood looking a certain way. Matching mailboxes. Approved paint colors. Grass cut to a specific height. Some of that is reasonable. Some communities like a bit of order, and I understood that when I signed the HOA agreement. But somewhere along the way, Karen's version of order became something else entirely. It became control for the sake of control. And my fence, apparently, became her personal obsession. It started small, the way these things always do. A letter in March claiming my fence violated setback requirements. I pulled out my original survey, the one from the county, the one used when the fence was installed, and I mailed a copy to the HOA office along with a polite note explaining that the fence had been there for 9 years and had passed inspection at the time. Silence for a month. Then another letter. Then a phone call from Karen herself, her voice sweet in that particular way that makes the hair on your arm stand up, informing me that policies had been updated and that the fence may need to be relocated for community consistency. I told her I would be happy to review any official surveyor's findings, but that I was not moving a 9-year-old fence based on a phone call. She said she understood. She did not sound like she understood. She sounded like someone filing away a grudge. For a few weeks after that, life went back to normal. My daughter had a piano recital. My son made the school baseball team. Melissa's roses bloomed early that year, big red blossoms crowding the fence line like they were trying to escape into the neighbor's yard. I remember standing out there on a Sunday evening, coffee in hand, thinking that whatever nonsense Karen Whitfield was cooking up had probably fizzled out. There was one more small sign I should have paid closer attention to. In late May, a maintenance truck spent an entire afternoon parked along the common area behind our block, 2 men walking the tree line with a handheld device, occasionally hammering thin wooden stakes topped with orange flags into the ground. When I asked one of them what they were doing, he just shrugged and said he had been hired to mark some reference points for the HOA and did not know any more than that. I did not think much of it at the time. I figured it had something to do with the irrigation system or maybe some landscaping project the board had mentioned in passing at the last community picnic. Looking back, I realize now those stakes were not random. They were the first quiet markers of exactly how far Karen intended to push every boundary line along our stretch of the neighborhood, mine included. At the time, though, I had no reason for suspicion, so I let it go, the same way most of my neighbors let 100 small oddities go over that year without ever connecting the dots. I was wrong to let it go, and I would come to regret that particular Sunday evening of quiet confidence more than almost anything else in this entire story. I woke up on a Tuesday morning in June to my son banging on my bedroom door, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and alarm. Dad, you need to see the yard. I will never forget walking outside in my socks, coffee not yet made, sun barely up over the tree line, and seeing my fence standing nearly 2 feet inside my own property line. Not fallen. Not damaged. Moved. Deliberately uprooted, repositioned, and reset into fresh concrete, cutting directly through the middle of my wife's rose garden. Half her roses were now sitting on the other side of the fence, technically in what used to be my yard but now looked like it belonged to the shared common area behind our homes. I stood there for a long moment, absolutely certain I was still dreaming. Then I noticed the small white flag stuck into the ground near the new fence post. A little laminated card was zip-tied to the top of it. It read, "Boundary adjustment per HOA Community Standards Committee. Property line corrected for consistency." Signed, in tidy cursive, Karen Whitfield. I want you to understand something. This was not a case of a fence falling over in a storm and someone helpfully resetting it slightly off. This was concrete. This was labor. Someone had hired a crew, dug new post holes, poured new footings, and moved an entire fence line overnight, on my property, without my permission, while my family slept. My son, 16 years old and normally the least excitable person in our house, kept walking the new fence line back and forth like he was trying to convince himself it was real. "They just did this while we were asleep," he kept saying. Nobody heard anything. A truck, machinery, anything. It was a fair question. Our bedroom window faces the side yard, barely 30 feet from where the fence sits. Melissa and I are not heavy sleepers. Yet somehow an entire crew had managed to dig footings, mix and pour concrete, and reposition a 40-foot run of picket fencing without either of us stirring. When I mentioned that detail to the police later, the officer raised an eyebrow and suggested, gently, that whoever organized the work likely chose a very specific overnight window and moved with practiced efficiency, the kind that comes from having done this exact job more than once. I called the police first, mostly out of shock. The responding officer, a younger man named Officer Delgado, walked the property line with me, took photographs, and jotted notes on a small pad, but he was upfront about the limits of what he could do. "Legally speaking," he said, "this looks like it's fundamentally a civil property dispute unless we can establish trespassing or malicious destruction of property, and to do that cleanly, we'd need to know exactly where the true boundary sits." He tapped his pen against the laminated card zip tied to the flag. "This note claims some kind of authority, but an HOA doesn't have the power to unilaterally redraw a property line. Only a licensed survey and the county records can tell you that for certain." In other words, I needed a survey. An official one. Not the folder of papers I had kept in a drawer for 9 years. A brand new, court admissible, professionally licensed survey, backed by hard measurements nobody could argue with. That afternoon, I called Melissa at work. She left in the middle of a client meeting, something she almost never does, and drove home to stand in the yard with me, staring at her ruined roses and the fence sitting where it had no business being. "She really did this," Melissa said quietly. Not really a question. "She really did this," I confirmed. That evening, I called 3 surveying companies before I found one available quickly. I explained the situation to the woman who answered the phone, and I could hear her go quiet for a second before she said, "We've actually had a couple of calls from your neighborhood this year. Let me get you scheduled." That sentence stuck with me. A couple of calls from your neighborhood this year. I started asking around. Quietly, carefully, the way you do when you suspect something bigger is happening than just your own bad luck. I spoke to my neighbor across the street, Frank, an older gentleman who has lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Frank told me that 8 months earlier, the HOA had adjusted the boundary between his property and the small retention pond behind his house, claiming the pond needed more buffer space for drainage compliance. Frank, who is 74 years old and does not enjoy conflict, simply let it happen because he did not want the hassle of fighting the HOA. I spoke to a young couple 2 streets over, the Alvarezes, who mentioned that a section of common area behind their home had somehow grown by nearly 10 feet the previous year, cutting into what used to be their side yard. They had assumed it was some kind of clerical correction and never questioned it. A pattern was forming, and it was not a pretty one. I want to pause here and say something important. I am not a naturally confrontational person. I do not enjoy conflict. My instinct, honestly, was to let the anger simmer quietly and handle everything through official channels, calmly and by the book. That is exactly what I did. I did not storm into an HOA meeting. I did not post a furious rant online, at least not yet. I gathered information. I requested, in writing, copies of all HOA meeting minutes from the past 18 months. Under most HOA governing documents, and under my state's laws, homeowners are entitled to these records. It took 2 follow-up emails and a mild threat to escalate to the state's HOA oversight office before the property management company finally sent them over. Reading through those minutes was like reading a slow confession. Buried in the dry, formal language of committee reports were references to a boundary standardization initiative, a phrase so bureaucratic and bland that it barely registered on first read. But cross-referencing the dates with what Frank and the Alvarezes told me, a picture began forming. Over the previous year, the HOA, under Karen's direction, had been quietly expanding common area boundaries into individual homeowners' yards, a few feet here, a few feet there, always framed as corrections or standardizations, always done without individual homeowner consent, and always done to properties belonging to residents who, for one reason or another, were unlikely to fight back. Elderly homeowners. Homeowners who traveled frequently for work. Homeowners going through hardship. Why would an HOA want more common area? I wondered that too, until I found the answer in the minutes from 4 months earlier. A proposal, tabled for future discussion, to lease a portion of the expanded common area to a telecommunications company for a new cell tower installation. The HOA would receive a monthly lease payment. The board, Karen included, had voted unanimously to explore the opportunity, though it never went further than initial discussion. Suddenly, the 18 inches into my rose garden made a lot more sense. My property, and Frank's, and the Alvarez's, sat along the exact stretch of common area that would be needed for tower access and equipment placement. Move enough boundary lines quietly enough, over enough time, and the HOA could It was clever, in a deeply dishonest way. And it might have worked indefinitely if Karen had not made one critical mistake. She moved my fence. Not Frank's, who would not have fought back. Not the Alvarez's, who did not know better. Mine. And I happen to be the kind of person who, once pushed past a certain point, does not let things go quietly. The survey crew arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after I woke up to find my fence sitting in the wrong place. 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing reflective vests, pulled up in a truck loaded with equipment I did not recognize. Total stations, they called them. GPS units. Long fiberglass rods with prisms on top. They set up methodically, taking readings from multiple fixed points, checking their equipment against county benchmark markers, working with the unhurried precision of people who understood their measurements might end up in a courtroom. I stood at the edge of my driveway most of the morning, watching, occasionally answering questions, mostly staying out of their way. Around 11 o'clock, exactly as I had hoped, Karen Whitfield's silver SUV pulled up along the street. She got out slowly, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. She walked over to the lead surveyor, a calm, weathered man named Gary who had clearly done this exact interaction more times than he cared to count. "I'm sorry, who authorized this?" Karen asked, her voice carrying that same sweet, sharp edge I remembered from our phone call months earlier. "The property owner did," Gary said, nodding toward me. "This is a licensed boundary survey. Standard procedure." "The HOA has its own boundary determinations," Karen said. "There's no need for—" Gary interrupted, gently but firmly. "An HOA doesn't determine legal property boundaries. That's established through recorded plats, deeds, and licensed survey work. If there's a dispute about where a line sits, this is exactly how it gets resolved." I watched something flicker across Karen's face. Not quite panic. Not yet. More like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a great deal of pressure for a very long time. She stayed for almost 2 hours, hovering at the edges of the property, occasionally making phone calls, occasionally trying to engage the survey crew in conversation they clearly had no interest in having. To her credit, or perhaps just to her stubbornness, she did not leave. By early afternoon, Gary walked over to me with a printed diagram in his hand. He crouched down and pointed to a series of numbers and lines that meant very little to me on their face, but his explanation made everything painfully clear. "Your original boundary, based on the recorded plat and the survey monument we located at the northeast corner, sits right here," he said, tracing a line on the paper, "which lines up almost exactly with where your original fence was. The fence that's currently installed sits 1 foot 10 inches inside your property line. Somebody built directly through your actual legal boundary and into your yard." I asked him to say that last part again, loud enough for Karen to hear from where she stood. She heard it. I watched her hear it. "There must be some error with the plat," Karen said quickly, walking closer. "Our records show." Gary said, and I noticed his tone shift slightly, the professional patience of a man who spends his career dealing with exactly this kind of resistance. "I've cross-referenced 3 separate recorded documents and 2 physical monuments set by the county. This isn't a matter of interpretation. This is the legal boundary. If your HOA has different records, I'd very much like to see them, because right now what I'm looking at is a physical fence that was moved onto private property without a corresponding legal survey to support it." Karen did not have an answer for that. For the first time since I had known her, Karen Whitfield had absolutely nothing to say. Over the following 2 weeks, everything unraveled with a speed that honestly surprised even me. I filed the official survey with the county recorder's office, creating a permanent legal record. I sent a formal demand letter to the HOA, drafted with the help of a real estate attorney, requiring the fence be restored to its correct legal position at the HOA's expense, along with compensation for the destroyed portion of Melissa's rose garden. I also did something else. I requested, formally and in writing, an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss what I now had documented evidence of, a pattern of unauthorized boundary alterations affecting at least 3 properties, tied to undisclosed discussions about a commercial lease arrangement that the board had never disclosed to the general membership, despite governing documents requiring exactly that kind of disclosure for anything affecting common area use. That meeting was, without exaggeration, one of the most tense 2 hours I have ever sat through. The meeting hall was packed, far more residents than I expected, many of whom, it turned out, had their own quiet suspicions about small discrepancies in their own yards over the past year but had never said anything out loud. I presented my survey. I presented the meeting minutes I had requested. I presented copies of the boundary adjustments affecting Frank's property and the Alvarez's property, both of whom, once they understood the full picture, agreed to speak up alongside me. Karen tried, at first, to frame it all as a series of honest administrative mistakes. But when another board member, a quieter woman named Patricia, who I later learned had voted against the cell tower discussions from the start, spoke up and confirmed that Karen had specifically instructed the maintenance contractor to make the adjustments discreetly and to avoid formal homeowner notifications, the room shifted entirely. By the end of that meeting, a motion was raised and passed, with an overwhelming majority, to remove Karen Whitfield from the HOA board effective immediately, pending a full independent audit of all boundary changes made during her tenure as president. I would love to tell you Karen faced some dramatic, sweeping consequence, the kind you see in movies. The truth is quieter than that, and maybe more realistic. She was removed from the board. The audit confirmed boundary alterations on 4 separate properties, all of which were formally corrected and restored at the HOA's expense. The proposed cell tower lease, once exposed to daylight, was quietly abandoned entirely, with the new board issuing a formal policy requiring individual written homeowner consent, backed by licensed survey work, for any future boundary-related decisions. Frank, once he understood the full scope of what had happened to the strip behind his house, finally agreed to have his own section resurveyed, and sure enough, the retention pond buffer had been expanded nearly 3 feet into his property, all without a single formal notice ever reaching his mailbox. The new fence line was restored within a month, and Frank, in his own quiet way, started showing up to every HOA meeting after that, sitting in the back row with a small notebook, just watching. The Alvarezes got their side yard back too, along with a written apology from the property management company, something I suspect never. The new HOA board, led now by Patricia, adopted something they started calling the transparency policy, requiring any proposed change to common area boundaries, easements, or shared amenities to be posted publicly, in writing, at least 30 days before any vote, along with the full financial details of any related agreements. It is a small thing, a handful of extra paragraphs in a governing document nobody reads until they need to, but it closes exactly the kind of quiet gap that let all of this happen in the first place. Karen still lives in the neighborhood. I see her sometimes, working in her yard, or driving past. We do not speak. There is no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no satisfying final showdown. Just a quiet, permanent shift in how much power one person is allowed to hold over an entire community of homes. My fence sits exactly where it should now, on the exact line the county recognizes, held up by real evidence instead of someone else's convenience. Melissa's roses took most of that first season to recover from being uprooted and crammed back into soil that had just been disturbed by concrete work, but I think about that morning a lot, standing in my socks in the wet grass, staring at a fence that had no business being where it was. At the time, it felt like the smallest possible violation, a couple of feet of dirt, a handful of roses, an inconvenience I assumed I could resolve with one polite phone call. It taught me something I did not expect a fence to teach me. Small quiet abuses of power rely entirely on people not checking. They rely on exhaustion, on the assumption that homeowners will not bother requesting records, will not bother hiring surveyors, will not bother showing up to meetings and asking uncomfortable questions. The moment you introduce real documentation, real licensed professionals, and real public accountability, that kind of quiet manipulation cannot survive the sunlight. If there is one thing I would tell anyone dealing with an HOA that feels like it is overstepping its actual authority, it would be this. Do not argue with opinions. Do not argue with clipboards or laminated signs zip-tied to stakes in your yard. Get the actual official survey. Get the actual meeting minutes. Get the actual paper trail. Power that depends on people not checking tends to fall apart remarkably fast the moment somebody finally does. My fence is just a fence again now, plain and white and unremarkable, exactly the way it was for 9 quiet years before all of this started. But every time I walk past it, I think about how close an entire neighborhood came to losing pieces of their yards to a plan nobody agreed to, hidden behind polite language and community newsletters, and how the whole thing finally came apart, appropriately enough, over 18 inches of stolen ground and a stubborn refusal to just let it go. Sometimes the biggest fights really do start with the smallest lines. If you take one thing from our experience, let it be this. Trust your own paperwork over anyone else's confident tone. A calm voice and a clipboard can sound exactly like authority even when there is none behind it. The people who count on you never checking are usually the ones with the most to lose once you finally do. My fence is proof of that, standing quietly back on its correct line, roses climbing along it every spring as if nothing ever happened at all.